When single mom Emma Carter faced eviction despite paying rent and living in unsafe conditions, it seemed hopeless. Ruthless landlord Victor Hargrove thought his power made him untouchable. But Emma fought back, uncovering his lies and rallying others to her side. You won't believe how justice finally prevailed. Emma Carter stood frozen in the dimly lit lobby of her decaying apartment building, clutching a crumpled piece of paper as if it might somehow disappear. The words on the notice burned into her mind. Eviction in 30 days. Her breath hitched, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. She read the letter again, hoping she'd missed something, some small mercy hidden between the lines. There was none. Her eyes darted to the peeling wallpaper, the flickering fluorescent light overhead, and the water-stained ceiling that leaked every time it rained. She had paid every rent check on time, month after month, despite the indignities of living in a building that seemed to be crumbling around her. The heater hadn't worked all winter, forcing her to wrap her 8-year-old son Liam in layers of blankets at night. The roaches scuttling across the kitchen floor were an ever-present reminder that the landlord, Victor Hargrove, couldn't care less about his tenants. Emma's heart thundered in her chest, equal parts fear and rage. She knew who Victor was, a man with a pocket full of properties and a soul as empty as this building. He didn't just own apartments, he owned people's homes, their lives, their safety. Stories about his tactics spread like wildfire among tenants, forced evictions, skyrocketing rents, and constant harassment until people gave up and left. As if on cue, Victor strode into the lobby. His polished leather shoes clicked on the cracked tiles, and his tailored suit seemed completely out of place against the backdrop of decay. He didn't belong here, and yet he was the one holding all the power. His smug smirk widened as his gaze landed on Emma. "Ah, Miss Carter," he drawled, his voice slick with mock concern. "I see you've received my notice. I wanted to personally assure you it's nothing personal, just business." Emma's grip on the paper tightened, her knuckles whitening. "Just business?" The words reverberated in her head, each syllable dripping with indifference. Her vision blurred, but she refused to let him see her break. Not here, not in front of Liam, who was upstairs likely trying to figure out why his mom hadn't come back with dinner yet. "You can't do this," she managed, her voice shaking but firm. "This building is falling apart, and you've done nothing to fix it. I've paid my rent. I've followed the rules. You have no right." Victor chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "Rights? Miss Carter, you seem to be under the impression that this is a democracy. It's not. It's my property, and you've had your time here." Emma stepped closer, her voice rising. "This is illegal. You think you can bully people like this? Force families out onto the street for your profit?" Victor's smirk never wavered. "Take it to court if you want. You won't win. No one ever does." He turned on his heel, his expensive cologne lingering in the stale air, and strolled out as if he hadn't just threatened to uproot her life. Emma stood there, shaking, staring at the door long after it had slammed shut. The paper in her hand crumpled further, the words, "Eviction in 30 days," glaring back at her like a taunt. Anger bubbled beneath her fear, rising to a boiling point. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every tenant in this building, every person Victor Hargrove thought he could step on without consequences. For the first time in a long time, Emma didn't feel helpless. She felt something else entirely, determination. Emma's days blurred into a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. Every morning, she woke up with a tightness in her chest that refused to ease, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. Where would they go? How would she keep Liam safe? The cold, hard truth of their eviction loomed over her like a storm cloud, casting shadows on even the smallest moments of peace. Her evenings were consumed by endless scrolling through housing listings. Each one she found came with its own brand of heartbreak. Too expensive, too far from Liam's school, or in even worse condition than the crumbling walls she already called home. The hope that flickered in her chest at the sight of a promising listing was snuffed out every time she saw the rent. She began to dread opening her laptop, but what choice did she have? Her son needed a roof over his head. Liam, as perceptive as any 8-year-old could be, noticed the tension in his mother's shoulders, the way she barely touched her dinner, the dark circles under her eyes. He tried to lighten the mood with his innocent optimism. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll find a place with a big backyard. I can finally get that puppy we talked about." His words were cheerful, but his trembling hands as he fidgeted with his fork betrayed his fear. Each time Liam tried to lift her spirits, it only broke her heart more. Emma smiled for him, nodding along, but inside, she felt the crushing weight of knowing she couldn't promise him that backyard or that puppy. She couldn't promise him anything. Determined to fight, Emma sought out legal help. She visited legal aid offices, called pro bono lawyers, and even sat through hours of waiting at community centers. Each meeting ended the same way, with sympathetic looks and polite rejections. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter, but we just don't have the resources to take your case." Desperation began to creep into her thoughts. With every closed door, her anger at Victor Hargrove burned hotter. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every family he'd pushed to the brink for his greed. One evening, after yet another fruitless attempt to find a lawyer, Emma sat alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by eviction notices, tenant agreements, and notes she'd scribbled from hours of research. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting an eerie glow on the piles of paper. In her hands was a dog-eared copy of a tenant rights guide she'd borrowed from the library. She had read it so many times the pages were beginning to fray. Emma's anger slowly gave way to determination. Victor had broken laws. She was sure of it now. Late repairs, unsafe conditions, retaliatory evictions. Every page she read added another layer to her case. But knowing it and proving it were two different battles. The enormity of what lay ahead weighed on her like an anchor. For every rule Victor had broken, there was a mountain of legal jargon she didn't fully understand. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of paperwork, her own inexperience threatening to pull her under. Then, one afternoon, as she sat at the table, head in her hands, Liam walked through the door. His backpack hit the floor with a thud, and he froze when he saw her. Emma didn't hear him at first. She was too busy trying to stifle the sobs that racked her body. She had tried so hard to keep her tears from him, to be strong, but in that moment, the weight of it all was too much. "Mom?" Liam's small voice cut through her haze. He stepped closer, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. "Why are you crying?" Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears, and tried to muster a smile. I'm just tired, sweetheart. That's all." But Liam wasn't fooled. He climbed into her lap and wrapped his small arms around her neck. His warmth was a balm to her frayed nerves. "You're the strongest person I know, Mom," he whispered, his voice steady and sure. "You can do this. I know you can." For a moment, Emma didn't move. She simply held him, letting his words sink in. He was just a child, but in that moment, his unwavering faith in her felt like a lifeline. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for him, for their future. Liam pulled back and smiled at her, his gap-toothed grin full of hope. "We're gonna be okay, Mom. You'll figure it out. You always do." As he ran off to grab a snack, Emma wiped her tears, her resolve hardening like steel. Liam believed in her, and for him, she would keep fighting. No matter how impossible it seemed, she would find a way to win. The day of the hearing arrived, and Emma Carter stood outside the courthouse, her hands gripping a battered binder filled to the brim with evidence. Her heart pounded as she stared at the imposing doors, each breath an effort to calm the storm brewing inside her. She was just one woman against a man who could buy his way out of any problem, but she wasn't here to give up. She was here to fight. As she entered the courtroom, the cold air and murmurs of the small audience heightened her anxiety. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, sat at the bench, flipping through files. At the defendant's table sat Victor Hargrove, looking as if the whole affair was an inconvenience rather than a serious legal matter. His custom-tailored suit and gold watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, his attorney, a sleek, confident man who clearly knew his way around a courtroom, leaned over to whisper something, prompting Victor to chuckle. Emma took her place at the plaintiff's table, smoothing out her modest blouse and squaring her shoulders. She felt the weight of every tenant Victor had wronged pressing on her. This wasn't just about her and Liam anymore. It was about sending a message that people like Victor couldn't get away with their greed unchecked. When the judge called the hearing to order, the room fell silent. Emma stood, her binder clutched tightly, and began her opening statement. Your Honor, my name is Emma Carter, and I am here today not just for myself, but for every family who has been forced out of their homes by Mr. Hargrove's negligence and greed. Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. This isn't just about an eviction notice. It's about unsafe living conditions, ignored tenant rights, and the abuse of power. The judge leaned forward slightly. Her interest piqued. Emma flipped open her binder and began presenting her evidence. She laid out repair requests that had gone unanswered for months: leaky ceilings, broken heaters, infestations. Each document was meticulously organized, with dates, emails, and even photos of the building's deteriorating state. She pointed to a particularly damning image of water pouring from a light fixture during a storm. This is what my son and I lived with for weeks. I reported it multiple times, but nothing was done. These conditions are not just inconvenient, they're dangerous. Victor's attorney smirked as he rose to his feet. Your Honor, while my client sympathizes with Miss Carter's frustrations, we must point out that these claims are exaggerated and lack substantial proof of wrongdoing. Emma's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. Exaggerated? She pulled out a printed email thread showing her repeated attempts to contact Victor's office. This is my proof, and I'm not the only one. At that moment, the door to the courtroom opened, and a man in his early 40s walked in, his expression resolute. Emma recognized him instantly, a former tenant from her building, one of the many who had been pushed out. He approached the stand, and with the judge's permission, testified. Victor Hargrove offered me cash to leave, the man said, his voice steady. He didn't want to fix anything. He just wanted us out so he could raise the rent for new tenants. When I refused, he made my life hell until I had no choice but to leave. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and even the judge's neutral expression wavered as she processed the testimony. Victor's attorney quickly objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Mr. Hargrove, do you have anything to say about these allegations? Victor leaned forward, his smug confidence visibly shaken. I've always operated within the law, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Emma seized the moment. Then why are there so many of us with the same story? She gestured to the small group of tenants who had gathered at the back of the courtroom to support her. Their presence was a silent testament to the truth of her claims. The judge took a long pause, her gaze shifting between Emma's evidence, the tenants, and Victor. Miss Carter, she finally said, you've presented a compelling case. Mr. Hargrove, the court will review these allegations thoroughly. The tension in the room was palpable. Emma sat back in her chair, her hands trembling but her resolve stronger than ever. She had come to fight, and for the first time, it felt like she might actually win. The courtroom was still as the judge shuffled her notes, her piercing gaze fixed on Victor Hargrove. Emma held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It felt as if time had stopped, the weight of every moment leading up to this one pressing down on her. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice firm and commanding. Mr. Hargrove, your neglect and exploitation of your tenants are appalling. You have shown a blatant disregard for their well-being and legal rights. Not only is this eviction notice void, but this court orders you to pay damages to Miss Carter and fund immediate repairs for the building to ensure it meets safety standards. Gasps rippled through the room. Victor's face turned ashen, his confident smirk long gone. He opened his mouth to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp glare. Let me be clear, Mr. Hargrove. This court will not tolerate landlords who abuse their power and exploit vulnerable tenants. You are expected to comply immediately, or further legal action will follow. Emma felt a wave of relief crash over her, so powerful it nearly brought her to tears. The room around her buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and triumph. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. This victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to Liam, to the tenants who had shown up to support her, and to everyone who had suffered under Victor's greed. Victor sat frozen, his attorney whispering frantically in his ear, but it was clear the verdict had shaken him. Emma couldn't suppress a small, satisfied smile as she gathered her papers. For all his money and arrogance, Victor Hargrove had finally been held accountable. As she exited the courthouse, the sunlight felt brighter, warmer, almost as if the world itself recognized her triumph. A small crowd had gathered outside, and among them, a reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Miss Carter," the reporter called, "how does it feel to win this case against someone as powerful as Victor Hargrove?" Emma hesitated, still absorbing the weight of what had just happened. She smiled through her tears, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside her. "It feels like change, not just for me, but for my son and for everyone else who deserves better. This isn't the end. It's a beginning, Kinsa." The reporter nodded, jotting down notes, but Emma had already turned her attention to Liam, who was waiting for her on the courthouse steps. His face lit up when he saw her, and he ran to her, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist. "You did it, Mom," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You really did it." Emma knelt down to his level, her hands gently cupping his face. "No, Liam," she said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "We did it, together." That evening, as they sat in their tiny kitchen, the eviction notice now just a crumpled memory in the trash, Emma and Liam shared a simple dinner. The air felt lighter, freer, filled with a quiet sense of triumph. When it was time for bed, Liam hugged her one last time, holding on tightly as if he never wanted to let go. "You're my hero, Mom," he whispered. Emma smiled, stroking his hair. "And you're mine, Liam, always." As she turned off the light and climbed into bed herself, Emma stared at the ceiling, exhaustion tugging at her. But so did something else, hope. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the start of something bigger, for her, for Liam, for everyone who deserved a home they could truly call their own.